History knows many names that have become symbols of the struggle for freedom, but among them, there is one figure whose name resonates particularly loudly when it comes to unbreakable will and incredible courage. Harriet Tubman was a woman born into slavery who managed to turn her own life into a weapon against the very system of slavery. She didn't just gain freedom for herself. She returned to the place she had escaped from again and again to bring hundreds of others out. In the mid-19th century, America was a country of contrasts. In the North, there were factories, railroads, and the first signs of industrialization. In the South, there were cotton, tobacco, and sugar plantations, where slave labor remained the driving force of the economy. And it was there, on those lands, that millions of people of African descent lived in chains, deprived of the right to their own lives. Harriet Tubman's story begins in the 1820s in Maryland. She knew slavery not from books or stories. It was her reality. But one day, risking everything, she ran away. And instead of disappearing into freedom, as many would have done, she became a guide, a conductor, in the literal sense of the word. After all, we're talking about the so-called Underground Railroad. It was not a railroad in the usual sense, but a network of secret routes, hiding places, and people willing to risk their lives to help slaves gain their freedom. Tubman quickly became one of the most famous conductors. Rewards were offered for her capture, and she was sought after by fugitive slave hunters. But she returned to the South again and again, and each time, she brought a new group of freed slaves with her. This story is not just a biography. It is a chronicle of one person's struggle against a system that seemed unbreakable. It is the story of a woman whom her contemporaries called the Moses of her people. Harriet Tubman was born around 1822 in Dorchester County, Maryland. Historians do not know her exact date of birth. Records of slaves' births were rarely kept at that time. She was born into a large family with 9 children. Her mother, Harriet Green, known as Old Rit, and her father, Ben Ross, were also slaves. From the moment she was born, her life belonged not to her, but to her master. Harriet's childhood was difficult and short. From an early age, she worked in the homes of white masters, looking after children and doing odd jobs. When she was only 5 or 6 years old, she was beaten for the slightest misdemeanor. Later, she was sent to work on a plantation, where even more exhausting and dangerous work awaited her. As a teenager, Harriet experienced a trauma that defined the rest of her life. One of the overseers tried to punish a runaway slave and threw a heavy metal weight. The blow hit young Harriet right in the head. Since then, she began to have seizures. She would suddenly fall asleep, fall into a trance, and see vivid dreams or visions. Later, she herself called these visions messages from God, and it was they that gave her strength and faith in her mission. Slavery in Maryland had its own characteristics. Unlike the more southern states, there were a significant number of freed African Americans here. Harriet grew up observing this contrast. Some of her neighbors were slaves like herself, while others were already free people who could work for themselves, own their own homes, and even help those who remained in slavery. For the young girl, this was a constant reminder that freedom was possible, albeit at great risk. One of the early scenes that left a deep impression on Harriet was the slave trade. Hundreds of men, women, and children were taken from auctions further and further south, where working conditions on cotton and sugar plantations were even more brutal. Many of her brothers and sisters were threatened with being sold. Separation from her family seemed inevitable, and the fear of losing her loved ones forever became part of her early years. Yet a sense of resistance gradually grew within her. Harriet saw injustice every day. But unlike many who resigned themselves to their fate, she began to think about escape. Although these were only childhood dreams at the time, they would become reality a few years later. By the mid-1840s, Harriet Tubman's life was becoming increasingly difficult. Slavery in Maryland was merciless. Long days in the fields, humiliation, and the constant fear of being sold. In 1844, Harriet married John Tubman, a free black man. However, marriage did not mean freedom for her. According to the laws of the time, the status of a slave wife did not change. She still belonged to her owner. Moreover, there was a real danger that she would one day be sold to the South, far away from her husband and family. In 1849, the situation came to a head. After her owner's death, the question arose of selling the slaves to cover his debts. Harriet realized that she could be taken far south, to a place from which return was almost impossible. Then she made a decision that changed everything. She ran away. Her journey to freedom began at night. She headed north, following secret trails and using landmarks, the stars, in particular the North Star, which pointed the way to freedom. Harriet was not alone on this journey. She was helped by members of a secret network that would later be called the Underground Railroad. It was a chain of safe houses, secret hideouts, and people willing to risk their own lives for fugitive slaves. The escape was deadly dangerous. The laws of the United States at that time left fugitive slaves no chance of a peaceful life. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, followed by the stricter law of 1850, allowed slave hunters to pursue fugitives even in the North and return them to their owners. Any fugitive could be arrested without trial, and even free black people often found themselves in chains on false charges. Despite this, Harriet managed to reach Pennsylvania. She later recalled this moment. "I looked at my hands to make sure it was still me. Everything around me seemed different. I felt like I was in paradise." But freedom did not bring her peace. Having found it, Harriet could not forget those she had left behind. Her mother, father, brothers, sisters, and dozens of other slaves whose fates were similar to her own. She made a choice that seemed unthinkable to most, to return to the place she had escaped from, not for herself, but for others. This moment became a turning point. From a runaway slave, Harriet Tubman became a fighter, ready to risk her life for the freedom of hundreds. It was then that she began her journey into history as the Moses of her people. After Harriet gained her freedom, she could have started a new life in the North, far from danger. But instead, she returned to Maryland again and again, risking capture, being put in chains, or even being killed. These missions made her a legend. The network of slave escapes known as the Underground Railroad was not a road or a railroad line in the literal sense. It was a metaphor, a secret system of people who organized escapes. Those who accompanied fugitive slaves were called conductors, and the stations were houses, barns, and churches where they could hide. Harriet quickly became one of the most effective conductors. Between 1850 and 1860, she made between 13 and 19 trips to the South, according to various estimates. On each trip, she led groups of slaves to freedom, sometimes several people, sometimes entire families. In total, historians believe that more than 70 people gained their freedom directly through her efforts, and hundreds more received help thanks to her contacts and organization. Her methods were characterized by strictness and discipline. Tubman never allowed the slaves she led to turn back. She knew that if anyone returned, they could betray the rest. She always carried a revolver, not only to protect herself from slave hunters, but also to keep those who were afraid from making a fatal mistake. Her determination became legendary. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 posed a particular danger. According to this law, even the northern states were not safe. Slave owners could send agents north to catch fugitives. That is why Tubman began to lead people even further, to Canada, where British laws guaranteed them protection. She settled in the city of St. Catharines, Ontario, which became one of her bases. There is plenty of evidence of her cunning and courage. For example, during one of her trips, Harriet disguised herself as an elderly woman, holding a chicken in her hands to distract attention. On another occasion, she used songs as secret signals. By changing the words of well-known spiritual hymns, she warned slaves when it was safe to leave or when they needed to hide. Her activities made her a living legend. Newspapers in the southern states wrote about the mysterious woman who repeatedly led slaves away. A reward was offered for her capture, according to some sources, up to $40,000, a huge sum at the time, but they never managed to catch her. Her contemporaries called her Moses. Like the biblical prophet, she led her people from slavery to freedom. But unlike the myths, her story took place here and now, in the reality of mid-19th century America. Each of her returns to the South was an act of incredible bravery. She could have stayed in the North and lived a peaceful life, but instead she went into the heart of danger to save those she loved, and those she did not even know personally. It was this determination that made her a symbol not only of the struggle against slavery, but also of the strength of the human spirit. When the Civil War between the North and South began in 1861, Harriet Tubman saw it as an opportunity to expand her mission. Now the struggle for the freedom of slaves had become part of a national conflict. The Union Army needed people who knew the southern territories, could navigate swamps, forests, and villages, and understood how slave owners operated. Harriet was perfect for the role. She began working for the Union Army, first as a cook and nurse, caring for wounded soldiers and former slaves. But soon her abilities led to more serious assignments. She became a scout and spy. Thanks to her knowledge of roads, secret trails, and the habits of slave owners, she was able to gather valuable information for the generals. Her most famous military operation took place in June 1863 in South Carolina. Tubman participated in planning and conducting a raid on the Combahee River under the command of Colonel James Montgomery. In this raid, Union troops, together with a group of black soldiers, penetrated deep into Confederate territory. They destroyed plantations, set fire to warehouses, and, most importantly, freed more than 700 slaves. This episode made Harriet the first woman in U.S. history to actually command a military operation. For a woman born into slavery, this was an incredible achievement. Her personal courage and knowledge proved decisive once again. In addition, during the war, Harriet worked as a guide for Union troops, leading them through swamps and forests, helping them avoid ambushes. She also treated soldiers using herbs and folk remedies. By the end of the war, her contribution was clear. Not only had she saved hundreds of slaves before the conflict began, but she had also helped the Union Army win victories in the South. However, despite her achievements, the U.S. government refused to pay her a military pension for a long time. Only decades later, after a long struggle, did she receive a small allowance, symbolic recognition of her enormous contribution. After the Civil War ended, Harriet Tubman did not disappear from public life. Although the war had brought freedom to millions of slaves, the struggle for equality was just beginning. Tubman returned to Auburn, New York, where she had settled in the 1850s, and devoted the rest of her life to helping others. She cared for her family, particularly her elderly parents, whom she had managed to free from slavery before the war. In 1869, she married for the second time to Nelson Davis, a Civil War veteran who was almost 20 years her junior. Their union lasted until his death in 1888. But her main mission after the war was public service. She opened a shelter for former slaves and elderly African Americans, which was named the Harriet Tubman Home. Funds for its construction were raised through donations, lectures, and charity events, where Tubman herself spoke to the public, sharing her experiences and calling for help for those in need. Another focus of her work was the fight for women's rights. She worked closely with well-known suffragists Susan Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Tubman spoke at rallies, saying that women, like former slaves, needed equality in the right to vote. Despite her heroism and achievements, her life in her later years was far from comfortable. For a long time, the government denied her a military pension for her service during the war. It was not until 1899, decades after her feat, that she began to receive a stipend of $20 a month, a modest sum that barely covered her expenses. Harriet Tubman died on March 10, 1913, at the age of about 91. Her last words, according to recollections, were filled with faith. "I'm going to prepare a place for you." She was buried with military honors at Fort Hill Cemetery in Auburn. Today, the name Harriet Tubman has become a symbol of freedom and resistance to oppression. Monuments have been erected in her honor. Her image has appeared on U.S. postage stamps, and in 2016, it was decided to feature her portrait on the $20 bill. The idea of putting Harriet Tubman on the dollar bill was supported by a wide range of people, from politicians and activists to cultural figures and ordinary U.S. citizens. Many human rights organizations advocating for the equality of women and racial minorities called it a symbolic choice. Former Democratic presidential candidate Hillary Clinton noted that it was difficult to imagine a more worthy replacement for Andrew Jackson's portrait. Senator Bernie Sanders, who calls himself a democratic socialist, took a similar position, emphasizing the importance of such a step for historical justice. Harriet's legacy is not just the story of a woman who saved hundreds of people. It is a reminder that even one person can challenge the system, armed only with faith, courage, and an unbroken spirit.